So hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about perception. So let's define first what perception is. So perception is the sensory experience of the world. So when we talk about sensory experiences, this involves the five senses, which are the sense of touch, sight, sound, smell, and taste. So I believe that you're already familiar with these senses since it has been discussed even during your elementary years. Now, going back, when we talk about perception, this involves the different senses that the brain can process. So let's make it more comprehensive on our end of what is happening in our surroundings. So perception is the ability to detect changes in the environment, processing information based on what we see, what we hear, feel, hear, smell, or taste. So through this cognitive process, again, we can understand the situation and assess the environment around us. So as mentioned a while ago, there are five senses that we already know. Aside from those five classical senses, there are also types of perception, other types of perception. So first, spatial, this is the ability to be aware of your relationships with your environment and yourself. Form is the ability to retrieve information about the limits and aspects of any entity through outline and contrast. Vestibular, it helps maintain balance and control our posture. This is related also to auditory perception. And thermoception or thermal is the ability to interpret temperature on the surface of our skin. So other types of perception is nociception is the capacity to interpret very high or very low temperature stimuli. Itching is the ability to interpret harmful stimuli on our skin that causes scratching. Interoceptive is the capacity to interpret the sensations that indicate the state of our internal organs. So these are moments wherein if we don't feel okay physically, we can somehow know that there's something wrong inside our body, uh, specifically a particular part of it. So because we can feel it. And then kinesthetic is the ability to interpret information about the movement and velocity of our surroundings and our own body. So for example, when you're driving, you can estimate the speed of the vehicle surrounding you, which could help you know when to stop and go at full pace. So how does perception works? To put it simply, perception has three major phases for us to know, understand, and process the information based on what we see, feel, hear, taste, or smell. So the first process is the selection phase. So in the selection phase, we filter and choose the information we want to perceive. So for example, if you are attending a class and your teacher is discussing in front of you, while at the same time your classmate beside you is trying to talk to you. So in this scenario, you will be selecting what particular experience you should focus on in processing information. uh, if you will listen to the discussion of your teacher or talk with your classmate. Then the following process is the organization phase. So once we know what to perceive, we need to gather the stimuli in groups to give them meaning. So based on my previous example, if you want to listen to the discussion of your teacher, then those words that you heard from your teacher will be put into groups, making them into sentences or a paragraph. And the final phase of perception is interpretation. So when we have already organized those selected stimuli, then that's the time where we will be interpreting or giving meaning based on what we have perceived. So in connection to my example, those words and sentences that your teacher is saying, your brain will process them and give an interpretation of what your teacher is trying to say. So you can already comprehend or provide the meaning of your teacher's discussion. So as mentioned, perception has three major phases in processing the stimuli in our brains to interpret information. I would also like to discuss in detail the process of how visual perception works. So the most important thing is the presence of the environmental stimulus. So our world or our environment is full of stimuli that can attract our attention through various senses. Okay, so the first thing to happen is to be aware of the environmental stimulus around us. So when we draw our focus to a specific stimulus, like for example, you're sitting at a park, usually a lot of things will be visible to your eyes. Like for example, people, flowers, no, the birds, the sky, and etc. So that's the moment where you will be selecting a specific stimulus that you need to focus on. So for example, like you're at the park. Let's say uh, you saw this cotton candy vendor at the park. Now, that specific stimulus, the image of the cotton candy vendor will pass through the cornea and pupil and onto the eye's lens. So the cornea and lens act together to project an inverted image onto the retina. So then the image on the retina is then transformed into electrical signals in a process known as transduction. So this allows the visual messages to be transmitted to the brain to be interpreted. The electrical signals then undergo neural processing. So specifically a visual signal, then you will be able to perceive the stimulus object in the environment, the cotton candy vendor. So it is at this point that you become consciously aware of the stimulus. Next, you will be able to interpret and give meaning to the object, which is the next step known as recognition. So in connection with my example, you can already interpret that person is selling cotton candies. You expect, no, you're able to understand and you're able to expect that that particular person can provide or is selling cotton candies before his customers, and that person is also responsible for asking for payments and giving changes. So the last phase is the action process, so which involves motor activity that responds to the perceived and recognized stimulus. So again, on my example, now that you've seen the cotton candy vendor, you can now assess if you will walk towards the cotton candy vendor to buy something from him or not, or you'll just look at him at a distance. Okay. Now I will be also presenting to you some tips on helping us perceive more in the world around us. So this is a helpful way to at least improve our focus if specific things are important to us that need more attention. So the first tip is to pay attention to your surroundings. Be in the present moment. So need to be a keen observer. You have the capacity not just to look or feel what's happening to your surroundings, but rather include an in-depth understanding of it. Then make meaning of what you perceive. We do have different interpretations of our environment. That's why you need to practice putting these objects or stimuli into meaningful categories so that you can understand them and have a proper reaction or behavior towards what you meant on that particular stimulus. And lastly, take action. So it is impractical if whatever you are processing in your mind won't connect an action response to that specific stimulus. So an action might be a simple act as turning away or dodging a possible accident. However, the perceptual process doesn't always go accordingly to what we expect to happen. So perceptual disorders can impair the ability of a person to perceive objects or stimuli. So there are possible disorders that could affect one's mental processes. An example here is schizophrenia. No, this person has abnormal perceptions of reality. That person could see or feel something that an average person couldn't perceive. So there's also prosopagnosia, a disorder in which a person cannot recognize people's faces. And also aphantasia. This is a disorder in which people cannot visualize imagery in their minds. Usually, a person could do visualizations even though they still don't, even though they don't exist in that present moment. No, unlike people with aphantasia, they couldn't do it. It doesn't also limit to people having disorders, but the inability to do perceptual processes could also be caused by genetics, stroke, or brain injury. Okay, so I hope that you've learned something from this discussion video. If you have questions or clarifications, you may message me on my Shell UB Facebook account. Thank you for your attention and have a great day ahead.